Unparliamentary today, joined by Rachel Withers, freelance journalist and commentator. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Let's get straight into it. So, this is the final parliamentary sitting week of 2024, and I should add also the final unparliamentary webinar of 2024 because of that. And the government, it's fair to say, has a lot on its plate, as often is the case in the last week, the last sitting week. It's always the case of the government rushing to get its homework in on time. It's trying to ram through a whole stack of things, including electoral reforms, which, if successful, would have a major impact on our democracy. Anthony Albanese appears to have secured a deal with the Greens over its housing legislation after a nearly year-long standoff to do the uh, build to rent and buy to
Help
own,
to
I
buy.
think. Help to buy, that's
Help
it.
to
Help to
buy.
buy legislation. There are also social media banning legislation going on, immigration proposals all under consideration. And also, the government's decided to clear its plate a bit with dropping changes to gambling advertising, superannuation taxation, and some misinformation and disinformation laws, at least for this year. So, heaps to get through. Let's get right on. We'll start, Rachel, with electoral reforms. What's the government proposing to do?
So these are a package of electoral donation reforms that have been floated and talked about pretty much throughout this entire term. Labor was talking about doing this. There are other reforms that independents were pushing for, but this was Labor's package coming from Special Minister of State, Don Farrell. Sorry, that's my dog barking. And what this package does is ostensibly it's about taking big money out of politics. It will set, I think one of the most important things it does do is it lowers the donation disclosure threshold quite significantly from, let's see, what is it now? It's currently, oh, sorry. It's
10,000, I think. 16,
16,900
is it?
and now
Yeah,
it's going to be
16.
1,000.
1,000.
So that's a good thing. It's a shame that's not going to come in straight away. We won't have that for the next election.
No,
Um,
of course not. Why would you want that?
that bit, integrity experts, independents, everyone is fine with. It's the stuff around how money is spent in elections. Um, there will be a cap on spending. So that means that each individual campaign will be able to spend at most 800,000 in an individual electorate. And political parties at a federal level will be able to spend up to 90 million. So quite a different number going on there. That's very close to what Labor and the Coalition spent last election anyway. Like there was like 110 mil each. Um, and it will also put a cap on how much individual donors can donate towards those totals. So it'll be a $20,000 cap per donor per recipient. It is possible to donate to multiple campaigns, but there's some things in place to stop the number getting up
Hmm.
to the kind of outrageous numbers we saw from, for example, Clive Palmer at the
Yep.
last few elections. So that's really the gist of the reforms. They sound good, you know, on paper when you hear that, but
Yep.
what the concern is coming from a large number of independents and crossbenchers is that this will actually really significantly disadvantage independents and new entrants, and it will hugely advantage existing players and major parties, partly because the parties will have this massive spend they can distribute across different electorates. So, they've got that 800 limit in each electorate, but there'll be this massive spend across the country. They can just advertise Labor or Liberal in their marginal seat campaigns. And the other thing is it will also massively increase the amount of public funding that goes towards candidates. Any candidate that gets more than 4% of the vote gets a certain amount of public funding per vote that they got. And what this does is to make up for the fact they're taking big donors out of politics, they'll replace that with public funding, increasing it for about like $3.50 to $5 a vote. And independents are saying hang on, that means that the major parties will be paying themselves a lot more money because they run in every seat across the country. And they do get more than 4% of the vote in pretty much every seat they run in. So it means that there's going to be a lot more money going to the major parties and a lot less ways for independents to raise money and spend money.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of confusion being sown, I think, about these laws, and cleverly done by the major parties, in that there is this great distrust of big money coming into elections, and the concern that, oh, we're going to be like America, where money controls it all, and using Clive Palmer as the big bogeyman of we've got to stop that. And it's become this view that all donations are terrible and we need to get rid of donations somehow, and forgetting that actually the political parties don't really care about donations. The Liberal Party doesn't need to worry about donations because it's got its big, in a sense, a trust fund that it is drawing on, and that doesn't count as donations. Um, and even when you think about the public funding and raising the public funding, and there's this view, oh, well, that's fair enough. But the reality is that massively favors incumbents, and you only get the money afterwards. It doesn't actually help with you spending money during your election campaign, especially, you kind of have, if you're relying on that, you're making a fairly big bet as an independent that you're going to be able to recoup that by getting the 4%. So, yeah, it's certainly our research that we've been done has certainly shown that this is probably not the best, or definitely not the best way to go about actually reforming the system. It's more entrenching the two-party system. Is that kind of
Yeah.
how you're seeing it?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Bill Brown has done incredible work for you guys on this. The Centre for Public Integrity has been putting stuff out. Independents have been making the case, particularly Kate Cheney, the member for Curtin, who was on the committee that looked at the idea of electoral reform prior to this bill being put forward by Don Farrell the week before last, Friday before this final sitting period. But I think the really telling thing about this, amidst all this criticism and discussion, and yes, we want to get, obscene mega donors out of politics, but what's a fair amount? How do we not disadvantage new entrants who are maybe getting lots of donations, small donations from lots of different community members? I think what's really telling is that the major parties do not want to have any kind of inquiry into this legislation. Independents attempted to move to have an inquiry in both the Senate and the House, but no, the major parties have decided they're going to sort this one out behind closed doors between the two of them. There might still be some amendments that come through based on the coalition wanting a little tweak here or there. Apparently, they're not so big on the $1,000 $1,000 disclosure number. But ultimately, it does seem like the major parties have decided they're going to do this one together. And I think that's what really alarms people.
Yeah, it's a nice little pushback to all these calls for, oh, we need more bipartisanship in politics. And this is a good example of when there is bipartisan in politics. It's generally because it benefits the two parties who are being bipartisan about it all. So the other aspect is, of course, that if how likely is this going to get through? Is this going to get done before the end of the week? Are they going to get it all through? It seems.
It seems like it to me. It was just sailing through its various reading stages last week. It hadn't actually passed, but every attempt to try to slow it down by the independents had failed. And I would be confident that the major parties are going to get this one through, partly because despite all of the reporting and criticism and reports being put out by groups like the Australia Institute, this is one that hasn't really grabbed public attention in the way that I really think it should. It's a change to how our electoral system works. But I think Labor has done a great job of kind of waving it away as like, it's about Clive Palmer. It's about those evil big donors. But one thing that I think that's a very clever way to frame this. But one point that came up when I was having a conversation with Simon Holmes-A-Court, the convener and founder of Climate 200 last week for my column in Crikey, was that really, really rich people who influence our political system are not going to be stopped by this. People like Harry Stokes, Rupert Murdoch, Gina Reinhart, their influence doesn't come through donations. It's done in different ways. And so, yes, while it sounds great to get rid of Clive Palmer, who spent 120 million last election and got one senator out of it by a bit of a fluke of preference flows, it isn't actually going to stop all the corporate and rich people influence in our political system.
Yeah, I mean, a key, I think one of the sneaky aspects about it is this sense of, oh no, we're putting a limit on how much each candidate can spend, and so that really sort of is making a level playing field, and then realizing that so long as they don't actually have the candidate's name on anything, it's all good, you know. So
Yeah, if you
and
take the example of like Monique
yeah,
Ryan versus Josh Frydenberg at the last election, this legislation, when it comes into place in after the next election, would mean that Monique Ryan was able to spend 800,000, but Josh Frydenberg could spend 800,000, and the Liberal Party could also funnel some of their national total into that seat, advertising the Liberal, you know, whatever the three-word slogan is for that campaign. They could, you know, and on top of that, people like Josh Frydenberg, incumbents, ministers already have massive advantages because they could pop up on TV whenever they want. They have brand recognition. They have all these things that new challengers don't have. And now they will also be able to massively outspend their independent opponents.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder, especially with this public funding, that treasure your first preference vote. Don't just give it to the party who you think's going to win or you don't really care. You know, make them earn that money. And that's the main reason why they want your first preference, is because that determines the public funding, not the two-party preferred or anything like that. So if there is a candidate who you do prefer, go for them, give them the money in a sense. Don't just throw your vote away for no real reason. We have a preferential system. Use it wisely, I say. Let's move on to housing, where the government has done another deal, but this time not with the opposition, but with the Greens. There's a couple pieces of legislation, as we were saying before, the Help to Buy and the Build to Rent. And I was doing an interview earlier this afternoon on ABC Sydney, where I suggested that most of the work in the legislation was being done with the title rather than what was in there. So what's the actual legislation involved here? What's the Help to Buy scheme?
So the Help to Buy scheme is something similar to what exists at the state and territory level, I think. Various governments have tried this, which is a scheme in which the government will help co-purchase a property with a potential first home buyer. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me because I've been very focused on the politics of what's going on this week rather than the numbers. But essentially, the idea is that it will Labor claims help more people who otherwise wouldn't be able to enter the market. It's worth noting it is capped at 40,000 places. So that's 10,000 a year. It's not like suddenly anybody who fits into the particular income bracket and purchasing price requirements for this will suddenly be able to. It's going to be just 10,000 people a year. And I think that's been a little bit lost as Labor sort of claims that. There was a social media post the other day saying 70% of Australians would be eligible to buy a first home if this passes. Well, no, 10,000 will be.
And that's because the restrictions are for individuals earning less than 90,000 and couples, I think it's earning less than 120 combined. And it's quite interesting how, for such a policy, they're trumpeting that it's such a huge section of the population would be eligible, and yet when they're sort of talking about tax cuts and things like that, suddenly they're more concerned with, oh, this will hurt 20% or 25%. You know, it gets flipped. But yeah, you're right. It's only 10,000 homes a year or purchases a year. To give everyone some context, there's probably about 600,000 property purchases a year. So 10,000 not going to make a big dent. The
There's
2%.
also been,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, I'll let you
Yeah,
continue, Greg.
sorry. Basically, the big thing is you only have to have saved up 2% of your deposit. So rather than perhaps 20%. Problem is, in reality, there's a lot of banks that are allowing even small deposits. So even though it might enable 10,000 people to access this scheme, what percentage of that 10,000 wouldn't have been able to buy a home anyway is kind of up for debate. But I guess that's sort of the policy of, our view here at the Australian Institute is, look, it's not going to do any harm. It's not going to stoke demand or anything, but it's probably not going to do any good. Why have the Greens done a deal here?
Well, the prevailing theory is that the Greens, who have been pushing on these two pieces of housing legislation, they've been pushing for more. They started out pushing for their usual favoured demands of a rent freeze and reform to negative gearing and the capital gains tax exemptions. I know key topics of yours, Greg. And they've been sort of lowering those demands as time goes by. They came into this parliamentary sitting week just looking for 25,000 extra social and affordable homes, but in the end, they've caved. They've agreed to just pass the bill because the theory is that after a couple of lackluster election results, they are concerned about looking obstructionist, that they have been successfully painted as blocking housing legislation, even though with the last kind of housing standoff we had, there ultimately was a resolution with the Housing Australia Future Fund. But they are concerned. Labor came in saying we are not budging an inch. And so the Greens did, and they let go of all of their demands and agreed to pass Labor's bills, which they don't think will go far enough. But it's, it's that old adage, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And in this case, the Greens, who often do seek better than good, have realised they're not going to get it at this particular moment.
Yeah, I always love I'm just waiting one day for the good that the perfect is being given up for to actually be good. That'd be really nice, rather
Yeah.
than kind of nothing. As I say here, this 10,000 a year. This is real small potato stuff. All the work has been done in the title. And do you think that's been part of the problem? Is that the Greens' position is essentially it's not like this is terrible legislation that is going to ruin anything, or it's not going to change anything. But do you think the Greens failed to actually they were sort of trapped because they were having to explain policy to people who, I as we both do as journalists, trying to explain policy is not easy. And when you've got a policy called Help to Buy, people think, oh, yeah, that sounds good. Help to Buy. Why are you against this? And, was that the case? Is that sort of the more long-term impact of this, that the Greens are going to have to be a bit more careful about what they block if they can't actually explain why they're blocking it, and not just, oh, we're aiming for better, rather than perhaps they need to limit themselves to really just blocking stuff that is actually in there they can actually argue is going to do harm?
Yeah, a bit to try to address in there. I think um, the policy detail is complicated and Australians are not really paying attention to it, but I think they're picking up the vibes from Parliament and the vibes that Labor has very much been pushing is that the Greens are acting like blockers. We're the builders, they're the blockers. And supposedly that message is starting to get through to voters. I mean, there's a bit of conjecture about just how badly the Greens have been doing in a suite of results lately. Queensland has been treated like a big warning to the Queensland Greens, which does, of course, include housing spokesperson Max Chandler-Mather, who's been, I suppose, particularly obstinate. And I mean that, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but he has negotiated hard. And there is a suggestion that the Greens result, where the state election, they lost a seat, even as their primary vote went up, is a signal, or Labor would like it to be a signal to them, that they should stop asking for so much, because people aren't quite, there's always going to be a dispute about where the line is and how much the Greens, with their significant balance of power in the Senate, how far they should get to push. And I think how you feel about that really probably depends on how much you agree with their policies. But I think in this case, they've decided it's better to play it safe. If this is the last week of this parliamentary term, which it might be, which is why Labor is so keen to get so many things through. The Greens thought, we do not want to let Labor go to the next election saying that the Greens prevented us from doing anything about the housing crisis, even though, of course, this probably won't do a great deal for the housing crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's all a little bit of pantomime, which is, I think,
It always is.
the frustrating thing for us, especially here at the Australian Institute, who care mostly about policy and really, we have to deal with the politics because we want our policies positions that we think are worthwhile, getting pushed through. But it's governments for a very long time now have worked out that actually calling something that sounds good is hard to defeat sometimes. And unless it is very bad and you can actually, persuade people that actually work choices is not about a choice of work or things like that. It's sometimes if you've just got, home builder or job seeker or something and we're changing it, that sounds great. It can be really difficult. So
Yeah.
one area which I think is again, suffering a little bit from the complexity and the general lack of understanding of policy and perhaps technology is the social media age limit negotiations, which looked, I think, a week ago as though, it'll sail through in a bit of a bipartisanship between the Liberals and the government. Now seems to have hit a little bit of a blockage with the opposition. What's going on there, and what do you think's going to happen by Friday?
Well, I think this one is definitely going to pass by Friday, despite being the one that perhaps most shouldn't. The government has been quite keen to take this on ever since, News Corp started running a campaign, the Let Kids Be Kids campaign, and the coalition picked it up, and Labor didn't want to be seen as being behind. Now that Labor's put something forward, very, very rushed bill with an inquiry that had 24 hours to make submissions and got 15,000 submissions, with everyone from human rights groups to child mental health experts to the social media companies themselves saying this isn't a great idea. It looks like
oddly the Senate committee into it that went for 2 hours didn't hear from all 1,500 people.
No, there wasn't time to hear from 15,000. I mean, some of those 15,000 may have been prompted by Elon Musk posting about it on his social media platform and, basically suggesting this was controlling free speech.
It was interesting that part of the reason it was so rushed that 24 hours, and they also said because of this, could you keep your submissions to 1 to 2 pages? So someone was suggesting actually that kind of created an incentive for people to go, yeah, I can write 1 page of why this is terrible, and that way. And I certainly know a few friends who are certainly a bit more policy minded, but generally not ones who would bother about putting in a submission. Were like, yeah, bugger it, I'm going to dash off a 1 page email and send it on in. So
yeah, I think I saw Leo Puglisi, the Six News journalist, the teen journalist. Said he was writing something up between his exams. So what seems to be happening now is a couple of the people opposed to this include Greens, Teal Independents, One Nation. Like it's as usual, kind of a lot of the crossbench opposing something that the two major parties support. But we're getting a bit of jitters from some of the national senators and even a couple of liberal senators as well, who are concerned about free speech and the idea of potentially anything that involves adults also having to verify their identity to get on social media. Now, the government keeps saying that's not going to be part of it. But as Matt Canavan, I think, pointed out this morning, Matt Canavan, the national senator, has been making a lot of good points lately. It's very strange. I find myself agreeing with him more and more. But he said this morning, there's no guarantee here that there won't later be a digital ID that people are required to have to access social media. Keith Pitt is sort of, I wonder if the Elon Musk jumping on board prompted some of the more right-wing MPs and senators to also be like, oh, hang on, this sort of protectionist policy that we were pursuing first is actually not great for the free speech ideals that they cling so dearly to. And so I don't think that's actually going to stop it passing, unfortunately, because the coalition is still on board. Peter Dutton is still on board. It seems like because the coalition can have a free vote on things, they don't bind the same way Labor MPs do. It probably won't be unanimous, but there's enough of the coalition and Labor to get this through. And it's really interesting. Labor has sort of started playing politics with this, trying to attack the coalition with it, despite the fact it was something that the coalition first brought up. And so, yeah, we've seen like Amanda Rishworth, the social services minister, having a crack at the coalition for not being unified on this, when, I think it's actually really, really healthy that we've seen certain members of the Nationals and even one Liberal pointing out that, what, this is rushed. This is not good. This is not the way we should be making policy.
Well, and for anyone who actually has read the legislation, it's an absolute dog of an act, really. It's the requirements, and this is where the point about potential widening and broadening of the restrictions and the requirements is certainly there, where the requirement at the moment is for social media platforms to take reasonable steps, and that's the line, reasonable steps. And the reasonable steps are not actually defined. They're stated as, well, there are things that need to be done to be objectively viewed as being reasonable steps, and also the line that these reasonable steps will change as technology changes. And it's incredible. And also it's up to the minister in regulations to define, if they so decide, what those reasonable steps are, what social media platforms are covered. I'm seeing apparently now YouTube's not going to be covered, neither is TikTok, because you can access YouTube and TikTok without being a registered user. And so they're going to be exempted. I saw, unfortunately, the Department of Communications, my former department, the department I first joined when I was a public servant, covering itself in its usual glory when it comes to communication issues. One of the senior public servants was asked about VPNs and came up with this bizarre line that social media platforms should be monitoring people's use to make sure that they are actually in the country that they're in. So if you're
Easy. Why didn't someone think of that before?
So if you're using a VPN or your account's coming from America and you seem to be talking a lot about Aussie rules football, that should be flagged. Or so. It just seems it's completely unworkable, completely pointless. And I was thinking, very much reminded me of, again, a News Corp campaign of a decade or so ago of stop the trolls on Twitter and social media. And fortunately, back then, nothing actually happened, but a few little things were done that enabled them to declare victory. And everyone else just carried on as before. Whereas it seems with this one, the government was foolish enough to actually think it should do some legislation to change it. But we'll see what it actually ends up, because, of course, doesn't come into play until the end of next year, I think, is when we'd be looking at it. And at that point, people might see that actually it ends up being not much or perhaps a great deal. And we kind of have to wait and see a little bit, because the legislation is so vague and broad, and the whole system itself is so essentially unworkable, that it will be interesting to see if it actually comes to anything in practical terms, I guess.
Yeah, and look, it seems like it probably won't work, but it's still so sad to see our government jumping at what is essentially a moral panic, and passing something again without proper process or scrutiny.
Yeah, it's kind of strawberries in the social media networks, basically. Other bills that are in negotiation, especially with coalition, that viewers and listeners might be across or a bit unaware of, migration bills. What's happening with migration? And essentially, we're talking asylum seekers, really, here, aren't we?
There's been a few migration bills. One of them was the student international student caps that
Yep.
that were voted down last week or yesterday. It all blurs into one. But the Greens and Coalition voting down something that once again it was the Coalition that
Yes.
originally wanted. It does look like with kind of a whole bunch of there's also the Labor's reforms to try to once again lock people back up again after the High Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to lock up people indefinitely if they can't send them away. It looks like the Labor government is negotiating with the coalition on these ones, as they did with the last set of reforms. The coalition wants them toughened up a bit. I imagine we will probably see something pass there. Although we do have a different Home Affairs Minister to who we had last time this was going on. Probably worth noting. Yeah, when we were last rushing through what human rights groups said was draconian legislation to lock people back up again. It was Claire O'Neill in that portfolio. She's now in housing, and it's Tony Burke now in that portfolio. I don't think we hear the same level of like harsh, hardline rhetoric from Tony Burke as we were hearing from Claire O'Neill. She was all, this is the toughest legislation, like the coalition won't support it, they're not tough like us. I don't think we're seeing the same level of chest beating, which is maybe heartening, but then again, if they do a deal behind closed doors with the coalition to give them what they want to make this bill exactly what the coalition would have passed anyway, then what was the difference?
Yeah. Tony Burke, though, is pretty good at doing deals and getting stuff through. He certainly is probably the most successful minister, really, of the government when you look at all his IR reforms that he got through, which were fairly controversial on the surface, and he was able to get them through with not too much pushback or blowback on the government, certainly politically. So it will be interesting to see if he can get through, but the government has decided not to get through a few things. First one, gambling reforms. What were they proposing, or what were they looking at proposing, and what's going on there?
Yeah, so this has been going on quite a while. There was a report done by the former Labor MP Peter Murphy, who tragically did die since this report was released, that recommended a quite sweeping package of reforms, including a complete ban on gambling advertising. Labor sort of indicated a few months ago they were going to put forward something that was a partial ban, slammed by experts, independents. There was a real solid week there of people calling this one out. Again, Kate Cheney, who sat on that inquiry, was very strong on that. She loves the nerdy details of policy. So we really haven't heard anything about it since. It seems Labor's a bit spooked. They don't want to do the full ban, presumably because of their mainstream media masters who stand to lose some revenue over this, and the gambling companies themselves, of course. But yeah, they've decided rather than to have this fight, they've kind of just backed away. And they say, we've heard conflicting accounts, we've heard the legislation's not ready, we've heard, they need to have more conversations. But I think it's really quite cowardly. And considering the speed with which they are able to act on a social media ban for under 16s, it's incredible that it's taken almost like 18 months since this report from Peter Murphy. It might even be 2 years now for the government to respond. And it still doesn't look like they're going to respond with the full ban that was unanimously recommended by that committee.
Well, the kids can't access social media, but at least they can see the gambling ads while watching the footy. So life,
Small mercies
it's
for the
life
children.
balances out in wonderful ways. What about misinformation and disinformation? Try and sort out the misinformation around this bill for us, can you, Rachel?
Yeah, this was another interesting one where a whole bunch of different groups that you wouldn't think would agree all came out to oppose Labor's attempt to um, it was going to be a process in which there would be requirements on social media companies to remove misinformation and disinformation. But there was a lot of questions around who would decide what was misinformation and disinformation, and who would then have the power to punish the social media companies if they didn't do it or they did, and whose interpretation of opinion and
Mm,
misinformation. And we saw, I think originally it was like your kind of wacky senators, Jared Rennick, people like that, the former Liberal Senator Jared Rennick opposing this, but more and more like, um, you know, human rights groups came out against it, some constitutional experts. The Greens ultimately came out against it. A range of independent senators and MPs also opposed it. And the coalition, sorry, was always against this one, because they viewed it as like, the Ministry of Truth
yeah.
um, kind of analogy. And so, yeah, Labor has again just quietly shelved this one. There's just no chance of getting this through. Without the coalition, they basically need the Greens, and the Greens are not into it either.
Especially when the whole misinformation, disinformation legislation was not going to be covering truth in elections, and
Mm,
that political parties were going to be excluded. So it didn't seem to have a lot of friends anywhere if it was going to, if they were one of these senses where if you're going to be rigid about it all, you got to kind of not give yourself an out clause. Otherwise, it seems like, really, are you all that concerned about it? And yeah, I think one that they just kicked to the long grass, and I don't think anyone's, too sad, certainly politically, and no one in the ALP, I don't think, was prepared to die in a ditch for it. But one that perhaps was, certainly we here at the Australian Institute were much more in favour of, and were strongly in agreement with, and the government, certainly Jim Chalmers was pushing hard on it, was superannuation tax reforms. And there's a report in the Financial Review today, or yesterday I think it was, that they also seem to have been pushed off to some future time. What was the deal here with these superannuation tax reforms?
yeah. Look, I was also a really big fan of these tax reforms. I remember, the days that it came out and it seemed big and bold and brave. Not, hugely brave, but pretty brave of Labor, which was that they were going to increase the tax on superannuation balances over $3 million, because that is far more than the average amount that anyone would
Yeah, I
need.
think it covered about 80,000 people had
Yeah.
balances of over 3 billion.
Yeah, and they introduced this quite early, and it looked, there was a little bit of a cry from the coalition of broken promise. You said you wouldn't touch superannuation or you wouldn't tax retirement, but it sort of seemed like that was mostly dismissed. I thought this was going to be quite simple to get through, because yeah, who's got much sympathy for the handful of people with more than $3 million in their super? And it was going to raise a bit of money
Mm.
over a couple of years. The first year it would only be so much, but it would raise in the billions, 2.3 billion. It was budgeted to raise in 2027, 28. But yeah, it looks like there were a few issues that various independents had with it. Originally, I remember the Teals sort of questioning things like unrealized gains, certain technicalities about it. But in the end, a large, like the coalition obviously continued to oppose it. And the Greens, who wanted it actually to be higher, again, this is sort of that, depending where you fall on the perfect good debate, you might think this was probably the wrong move, but the Greens wanted the tax rate to be increased to 45%, and Labor wasn't willing to go that far. So yeah, it kind of it's been sitting on the table for a couple of years now, 2 full years, I'd say. But not going to go ahead. I think Labor has said they're going to take it to the election though, and I think that's a good thing. The complaint when they do any kind of tax reform is that they didn't bring it to the election, and therefore how dare they do it because they didn't warn people. But I think it's a pretty uncontroversial change, and a pretty fair one. People are sort of using the superannuation as a tax-free kind of uh, pot. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's good that they're going to stick with the policy, but it's a shame that it can't be gotten through.
There definitely is going to be a scare campaign on this because there has been one already. Interestingly, the Australian's Robert Gottliebsen has been, I think, actually leading the scare campaign, making it
Mm.
sound like this is a tax on grandma and grandpa, and even came up with the ludicrous argument recently that, oh, because if you've got less than 3 million in your super, but combined it's over 3 million and one of the couple dies and your superannuation is combined, that'll make you have over 3 million. I'm thinking, cripes, yeah. And so he's making it sound like, oh, this is actually an attack on retired women because often the man is the one who will die earlier, and so you're going to really be hitting these women who are essentially doubling their super and suddenly having to pay some tax on the bit that's over 3 million in that super, which is quite ludicrous. But yeah, I think, well, it is uncontroversial, I think, but that doesn't mean there won't be a scare campaign about it, as we obviously saw with the dividend credits imputation credits last time, which really affected bugger all people, and you had people thinking um, that they would be getting a check in the mail if these dividend credits came
Yeah.
through or something. So,
With these
um,
scare campaigns on issues like this one, I think this policy's been floating around since I wrote an essay 2 years ago on the
mm,
teals. And I remember speaking to, I think it was Zoe Daniel about this, and she said, a lot of the wealthy people in my electorate sort of go, yeah, that actually sounds pretty reasonable.
mm,
Obviously, the details need to be fixed up in terms of the concerns that people like the Teals had was around unrealized gains and um, how that should work. But essentially, like people paying tax, a lot of not all of them obviously, but a lot of the teal
mm.
voters who have this kind of money are like, yeah, I think we've had a good run. And so I think the scare campaigns, and we've seen this before with the retiree tax and the death tax, it seems to more be aimed at people who this doesn't actually
Yeah,
affect, who get scared
absolutely.
and think it's about them. Because those who are sitting pretty on $3 million know that they can probably afford to pay a little bit of tax.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing Labor might have in its pocket on this argument is that $3 million figure. People
Mm,
know that they don't have $3 million in super. I sure as hell don't, and I'm certainly not poor. And so, I'm on a pretty good wicket and have been for a while. My wife's been a school teacher all her life since 21. She certainly hasn't got anywhere near 3 billion. So,
yeah, this is a
whereas
real one percenter kind of policy
yeah,
we're
and
talking
it's
about.
easy to understand, basically $3 million. Okay, I'm not going to have $3 million. It's not going to affect me. Whereas dividend imputation credits, tax credits, it seems like, oh, hang on, I want a tax credit. Don't I get a tax credit? And it was too hard to explain. Whereas 3 billion, do you have 3 billion in your super? No. Well, then you don't have to worry. Is a bit easier than,
Yeah, hopefully.
but we'll see.
But then, I do think Labor's got a bit of work to do because we've
Yeah.
seen people like Tammy Tyrell coming out
Mm,
against this, the former Jackie Lambie Network senator, who's now an
yeah.
independent senator for Tasmania, sort of talking about the poor farmers.
Yes. Well, see, that's the main one of the big thing is the poor farmers, and what people don't understand is the only reason this would affect poor farmers, and we say poor farmers, if they've actually basically put their farm in their super,
Mm,
which
mm.
is not what superannuation is about. And clearly, if you're doing that, you're doing it to avoid paying tax. So, um, I'm sorry, I don't have much sympathy for the poor farmer who has put all of their farm in the superannuation so they can avoid paying tax on it. I think
Mm.
pay up, mate. All right, let's we're quickly run out of time. Let's have a few questions before I just want to before we get on to a quick question about Trump, but we got some. Claire Beddington has asked, Advance Australia reportedly targeting the Greens. Will they be subject to new political donation caps as they are not a political party?
Yeah, so with groups like Advance, things like Get Up, things like Climate 200, they're going to have a separate cap of $11 million to spend on federal election campaigns. So yes, they'll be affected, but no, they won't be kind of capped at, within either side's big cap. They'll have 11 million. And one thing that Simon Holmescott put to me was, what's to stop Clive Palmer from setting up his own Clive Palmer body that is, equivalent to Advance or even how Climate 200 works, and then spending $11 million promoting Clive Palmer or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's quite a few comments just wondering how the hell can the two political parties get away with this, and everyone is quite right. It is disgraceful. Richard Bentley's wondering about housing and kind of wondering where's the chat about public housing? Why isn't there a big sort of push from public housing that because that's where most of the demand or a big chunk of demand, especially at the lower end of the scale, exists. Why is the government perhaps not so concerned about that and keeps sort of focusing on the Help to Buy and things like that?
Yeah, I think they're really, really trying to pitch themselves at prospective first home buyers, the Australian dream. And they're trying to really sell this argument on how important buying a home is, because that's the voters they're reaching for. It's those kind of mortgage belt suburban voters that the coalition is also got their eye on. And so yeah, they're speaking to your classic swing voters, I think, with that. But it is a shame because things like public housing are so important, not just for the people on the massive public housing waiting lists, which are enormous, but also for all renters, because by having more public housing and more people who shouldn't be in the rental system out of the rental system, it actually brings down the price of rent for everyone. Greg, I think you've actually schooled me on that. Not schooled me, but I called you once for a piece on public housing and you pretty much gave me that answer. So
Yeah, and also, public housing doesn't need to just be for, there's the problem with public housing is that it now has this perception as just being for the very lowest income. And that's because only 2% of new home builds are public housing, whereas back when Anthony Albanese was living in the public home with his mum, as he likes to talk about, it was closer to 15%. And if you got 15% of new builds being public housing, that makes it much more common. You could, for example, as they do have done with Defence Housing Australia, there could be public housing for school teachers, for nurses, for public servants. And public housing could have no sort of stigma with it, which unfortunately it does now. And I think that's one of the big things we need to get
yeah.
rid of with public housing is this
Greg,
view that, oh, it's the poor people's.
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Anthony Albanese's log cabin story or public housing story, because that to me what makes it extra staggering that the Albanese government hasn't made public housing like a
Mm,
key feature of its government, because that's his story, that's his thing.
mm.
But no, apparently that's just a story, not about actually influencing policy.
And now the story also is that I saw this in the News Corp papers today about, oh, kids need to be out playing sport and swimming in the pool and doing art and crafts and things and not being on their screens. And I'm thinking, geez, what did you grow up in the 1950s? Yeah. I grew up in the 1980s. Said, yeah, I played a lot of sport, played a lot of cricket, and whenever one of my mates got a new Atari game, we played that all the time. So we weren't these out in the nature kind of people always. Okay, before we go, last few minutes, Trump, he is making a ton of appointments, all as bad as anyone could have hoped. Now, bad enough for Americans who are suddenly going to have people like Dr. Oz and Robert Kennedy Jr. dealing with their health and um, immunization and whether or not there should be fluoride in the water. Um, What about Australia? Is it a case of Australia might start looking at who's getting appointed for defence, national security roles, and think this might have some blowback for us if we keep sort of strapping ourselves to them as we have on AUKUS?
Yeah, well, look, I think the defense ones, especially because that's where we are truly strapped to them. I, immediately after Trump was elected, we saw a lot of the groups that were already against AUKUS being like, "Hey, time to think about whether we really want to be tied to these people." But I would say the Labor Party has made a real concerted effort to indicate that it wants to stick with AUKUS, that Kevin Rudd can stay despite having previously criticised Trump, that Kevin Rudd can stay as ambassador because he's so good on AUKUS. AUKUS is so important, even apparently with Trump in the White House. So um, I don't think it's going to change necessarily any of our foreign policy um, policies, but I do wonder that if we're going to see some Trumpian elements sneaking into our federal election next year. Apparently, the coalition is very, very interested in what has gone down over there. Dutton was already sounding quite Trumpian, I think, with his attacks on migrants and blaming immigrants essentially for everything that goes wrong in our society. But I think that we are going to see them double down on that, and hopefully we're going to see the Labor Party learn something from the Democrats' mistakes, and maybe focus a little bit more on how much people are seriously hurting and the fact that little tweaks around the edges and then making memes about it isn't going to help. But
Yeah.
at this point, I don't think anything we've seen in the past, the past sitting week has indicated that they are gonna learn anything.
No. Any sense of when the election's going to be? Do you think early or May?
I I think that the whole conversation just feeds itself. And I think I stick to it's staying in May. I think it's
Yeah.
staying in May. And I think we're all just, everybody's obsessed with any kind of like hint in the Prime Minister's wording or phrasing. It's going to be in May. That's my take.
Yeah. I mean, there have been a lot of valedictory speeches being done this
It
week,
has.
but to be honest, that's not unusual in before an election that could be held in the first few months. They often do get them out of the way because
You'd
generally, I
hate to
think
miss
you,
out.
yeah, you'd hate to miss out. And the one thing I know Richard Dennis, our executive director, always says there's actually only one person who knows when the election's going to be called, and probably he doesn't even know right now, and that's Anthony Albanese. And
Yes.
anyone suggesting they've got the inside word is just writing a story that hopes you'll read. And with that, though, I'm thankful that everyone, the 207 participants, wonderful turn up. Thank you very much all for being here, and we will wrap it up there because it is nearly 2 o'clock. Time for us to go on with the rest of our day. Please thank everyone. Could you please thank Rachel? Thank you, Rachel, for coming along for this
Thank you,
last
Greg, and thanks
one.
to the Australia Institute.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get them all, but there were a lot of repetitions, basically along the lines of, why is this so terrible? Before we wrap up, I do want to let you know that Australian Institute is publishing our first book as part of we are becoming book publishers. We're going to have we've got the Australian Institute Press, which is now to start up. Our first book is coming out this week as part of our 30th year anniversary celebration. It's called What's the Big Idea? And I should have actually had a copy of it because I do have a copy on my desk. Offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Annie Pat Anderson, Professor Peter Doherty, Amy Ramikis, me even. I get one in there basically saying, hey, wage growth, good thing. We should have more of it. You can pre-order it now via our website, australiainstitute.org.au. Follow the links. Please, again, remember to subscribe to Australia Institute on YouTube to catch all of our webinars, and also go to our website to subscribe so you can get in here and watch them all live and ask questions. Subscribe also to our podcasts on however you get your podcasts, such as Follow the Money, After America with Emma Shortis, and my own Dollars and Cents. But thank you all for turning in. I'm not sure if we will see you next week. I'm not sure what. I think we've got a book webinar on next week, so that will be something to look forward to. Other than that, thank you for tuning in for Unparliamentary. We'll see you all next year with another round of the Unparliamentary, but who knows when the election is, and we might have to do unelectionary or something. I'm not sure what we'll do. Other than that, thank you all for joining in. See you all whenever we do see you all. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.